In the courtroom, the black maid stood unwavering, her finger pointed directly at the billionaire. The moment her hand rose, the air seemed to freeze, thick with anticipation. Richard Harrington, once so confident, stiffened, his smirk fading as he met her gaze. Beside him, his mother, Beatrice Harrington, froze, her pearls clinking against her chest. The gallery fell silent, the tension rising. No one yet knew why the maid was so bold, but all could feel the storm she was about to bring. Clara Johnson had once been the pride of the Johnson estate, her father's pride and joy. Born into a world of comfort, luxury, and the sweet smell of prosperity, she never thought she would be standing here today, in a courtroom, facing the very people who had stolen everything from her. But here she was. The life she had once known was no more, and the woman who had once walked with her head high now stood with her back hunched, her hands roughened by years of labor. It wasn't always this way. Clara had been born into a family of wealth and influence. The Johnsons owned vast swaths of land that stretched as far as the eye could see, farms that fed entire towns, and homes that could have housed generations. Her father, Samuel Johnson, was a respected man in the community, known not only for his business acumen, but also for his generosity. He had raised Clara and her younger brother, Samuel Jr., in a mansion full of laughter and light. But it was Samuel's sudden death, a heart attack that took him too soon, that marked the beginning of Clara's downfall. Clara remembered that day like it was yesterday. She had been standing in the family kitchen when the news came, the sound of her mother's cry echoing in her ears. The walls of the mansion had seemed to close in on her as she was handed papers she didn't understand. Documents, legal terms. She had no idea that her world was about to shatter. Her grief made her blind, and in her blindness she signed away everything: her father's land, their legacy, their history. At the time, it seemed like an innocent act, a simple formality, a neighborly gesture from someone who was just being kind, right? But the woman who had come to offer comfort was not a neighbor, and the papers weren't just for taxes. They were for her soul. Beatrice Harrington had arrived, silk draped over her like a shield, offering empty sympathy. Her soft words lulled Clara into a false sense of security, and in her sorrow, Clara had let her guard down. Clara hadn't known then what she had lost. It wasn't until much later, when she went to her father's office to look for something, that she realized the estate had been signed away. The Johnson name, the land, the house, all of it had been transferred to the Harringtons. Clara had been reduced to a trespasser in her own home. Her father's name, once so proud, now belonged to someone else. The inheritance, the legacy, all gone in the blink of an eye. It was then that Clara's world began to unravel. The Harringtons, Richard and his mother Beatrice, had never treated Clara with any semblance of respect. They had stripped her of everything, and now, years later, Clara was a shadow of the woman she used to be. Gone were the days of elegance and grace. Now she was a servant, a maid, invisible to the world. But the fire that burned in her heart had never gone out. She had lived through years of hardship, but the bitterness, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it was all still there. For the next few years, Clara had struggled. She and her children were tossed from one small town to another, moving from one dead-end job to another. The wealthy families who once respected her family now looked down on her. She had become a figure of pity, nothing more than a black woman struggling to make ends meet. She was a cleaner in the homes of others, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, sewing clothes until her fingers bled. The woman who had once been the pride of a family was now a broken shell of herself, her dreams crushed under the weight of her poverty. But Clara never gave up. She told herself that one day, somehow, she would reclaim what was rightfully hers. She could never forget the family that had taken everything from her. The Harringtons had stolen her inheritance, and now she would find a way to make them pay. As the years passed, Clara's children grew up. Samuel Jr., her eldest, had left when he was just 16, chasing after a better life in the city. Clara's heart ached as she watched him go, but she never told him the truth. She never told him what had really happened to their family. Caroline, her youngest, fell ill one winter, her frail body unable to fight off the sickness that ravaged her. But Clara held strong, never letting her children see her despair. Even in her darkest moments, she kept telling herself, "We are Johnsons, and we will not break." But the poverty never left. The long, endless days of work, the nights spent in damp boarding houses, the constant struggle for survival. Clara had lived through all of it, and yet she had never once forgotten her name. She had never forgotten the family that had wronged her. For 35 years, she had kept her silence, waiting for the moment when she could strike back. She had bided her time, gathered the evidence, and now, after all this time, she was finally ready. The first time Clara had stepped back into the Harrington mansion, she had been a broken woman. But that day, something had changed. She had seen the help wanted sign, and it had pulled her back like a magnet. She had known that this was her chance. The walls of the mansion, once filled with memories of her family, now seemed cold and uninviting. But Clara didn't care. She stepped inside with a purpose. She was not the maid they remembered. Time had passed, and Clara had changed. She was no longer weak. She was no longer invisible. Clara's first day in the Harrington mansion had been a surreal experience. The polished floors beneath her feet, the gleaming chandeliers overhead, and the heavy portraits of generations of Harringtons lining the walls. Everything screamed wealth and entitlement. But Clara had walked through those doors with one thing on her mind: reclaiming what was hers. She was no longer the young, naive woman who had signed away her birthright. She had learned from her hardships, and now she was ready to take back what was stolen from her. The butler, a tall man with a cold gaze, had led her down into the servants' quarters. She had recognized the stairs immediately, those very stairs she had once run up as a child, her heart full of dreams. Now she descended them as a maid, her heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. The servants' quarters smelled of dust and cleaning products, a sharp contrast to the opulence above. Yet Clara couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in the familiar surroundings. This had been her home once, long ago, and now it would be her battleground. Her uniform, a plain black dress with a white apron, was nothing more than a symbol of her new life, a life that for the past 3 decades had been defined by hard labor, rejection, and sorrow. But Clara held her head high as she tied the apron around her waist. She wasn't just any maid. She wasn't just a servant. She was Clara Johnson, and this mansion, this place that had once belonged to her, was her domain now. The Harringtons might have taken her birthright, but they hadn't taken her spirit. As Clara scrubbed the floors, the memories of her childhood came rushing back. She remembered running through these halls, her father's hearty laugh echoing through the rooms. She remembered the warmth of the kitchen, the scent of freshly baked bread filling the air. She remembered the servants who had once served her family, their faces filled with respect and loyalty. Now she was one of them. She was on the other side, serving the family that had stolen everything from her. Beatrice Harrington, the woman who had once pretended to offer comfort, barely acknowledged Clara's presence. She would pass her in the halls, her lips curling into a thin, dismissive smile. Clara had been invisible to her, and Richard, her son, hadn't changed at all. He still carried the same arrogance that had burned in him all those years ago. He barely glanced at her, dismissing her as nothing more than a piece of furniture. But Clara wasn't a piece of furniture. She was a woman who had been broken, yes, but not defeated. She had a purpose now, and she would not be ignored. Over time, Clara became a fixture in the mansion. She worked tirelessly, cleaning, cooking, doing the work that no one else wanted to do. But she also kept her eyes open. She watched, listened, and learned. The house was full of secrets, and Clara was determined to uncover them all. She had seen enough over the years to know that the Harringtons were hiding something that could destroy them. But what? What was the key to unlocking the truth? Clara knew it was only a matter of time before she found it. The years passed, and Clara's resolve only grew stronger. She had become a quiet force in the mansion. The other staff members whispered about her, not understanding why she never complained, never spoke out, never showed her true feelings. But Clara wasn't interested in their opinions. She had one goal, and nothing was going to distract her from it. She had come here for one reason: to bring down the Harringtons. Clara's children had long since left the mansion. Samuel Jr. had gone to the city, and Caroline had married and moved away. Clara's heart had ached when they left, but she never showed them the true extent of her pain. She had been their rock, their protector. But now she was alone, surrounded by people who had no idea who she really was. The Harringtons didn't know that the maid they treated with such contempt was the rightful heir to the very land they now controlled. Clara's silence was her weapon. She had learned the art of patience over the years. The Harringtons might have believed her to be nothing more than a servant, but Clara knew better. She knew that her time would come, and when it did, she would not be silent. She would stand in front of them, just as she stood in the courtroom that fateful day, and she would point her finger at them with unshakable resolve. The documents she had gathered over the years were her ammunition. The deeds, the contracts, the notarized statements, every single piece of evidence had been carefully collected, hidden away from prying eyes. Clara had been methodical in her approach, collecting every scrap of paper, every conversation, every secret that the Harringtons had tried to bury. Now she was ready to expose them. The Harringtons had built their empire on lies and deceit, but the truth was about to come crashing down around them. And so Clara continued to clean the floors, to cook the meals, to serve the family that had stolen everything from her. She did it all with a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. She had learned long ago that the key to survival was patience. The Harringtons had underestimated her once. They would not make the same mistake again. Years had passed since Clara first returned to the Harrington mansion, but she had never wavered. Every day as she went about her work, she felt the weight of her father's legacy pressing on her shoulders. The mansion, once her home, now felt like a cage. The grand hallways, the fine furniture, the delicate tapestries, all of it was a reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. But Clara never let the bitterness consume her. She had learned to hide it beneath the surface, to bury it deep within her heart. She had a plan, and nothing would get in her way. Clara had spent years in silence, learning everything she could about the Harringtons and their empire. She knew that the documents she had collected, papers that proved the fraud and deceit, were her ticket to justice. But the time had to be right, She had to be patient. She had to wait for the perfect moment to strike. The right moment came when she least expected it. It was a cold, gray morning when the news broke. Edward Whitlow, the Harrington family lawyer, was dead. Clara had been polishing the banister in the grand hall when she first heard the news. The rag in her hand trembled as she processed the information. Edward had been the one who had drafted the contracts that had stolen her family's estate. He had been the one to help Beatrice Harrington forge the documents that had stripped her of everything she once held dear. His death, though tragic, could prove to be the key to bringing the truth to light. Clara didn't waste any time. The next day, she received an envelope, hand-delivered to the mansion's back door. The butler had given it to her with no explanation, just a puzzled look on his face. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the handwriting. It was Edward's. Her breath caught as she opened the envelope, her fingers shaking as she unfolded the letter inside. It was a confession. Edward's confession. He had written about the fraud, the lies, and the forged documents. He had admitted to his role in the scheme that had taken everything from her. For the first time in decades, Clara felt the fire of justice burn bright within her. She had what she needed. The proof, the truth. The evidence was in her hands, and with it, she could bring the Harringtons down. She carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her worn leather satchel. But before she could even think about the next step, she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. It was Richard Harrington. He walked past Clara, his eyes not even bothering to acknowledge her existence. He was the same arrogant man he had been all those years ago. But Clara wasn't afraid. She didn't flinch as he passed her, didn't lower her eyes. She stood tall, a woman who had endured more than he could ever imagine. The days that followed were a blur of preparations. Clara knew that she had to move quickly. She could no longer afford to wait. She had to make her move. But she also knew that she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone who could navigate the complex legal world and ensure that her evidence would stand up in court. The thought of it was terrifying. She had spent so many years in the shadows, hidden from the world, but now she had to step into the light. She had to expose the Harringtons for who they truly were. Clara walked through the streets of the city, her satchel clutched tightly in her hands. She had been here before, but it had been so long. The familiar streets, the same faces, nothing had changed. But Clara was different now. She wasn't the same broken woman who had walked these streets all those years ago. She had a purpose now. She had a plan. She would fight for what was rightfully hers. The Legal Aid Center was tucked away in a narrow alley, a squat brick building wedged between two towering skyscrapers. Clara hesitated for a moment before walking through the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and ink. The young lawyer at the desk looked up as she entered, his eyes scanning her face before they landed on the satchel in her hands. He wasn't expecting her. He wasn't expecting anything, really. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked gently. His voice was soft, but there was a strength to it that Clara appreciated. She placed the satchel on the desk, her hands trembling as she opened it. "I need someone to see this," Clara said, her voice steady but firm. She didn't look at him as she spoke. She couldn't. This was too important. This was everything. The lawyer's fingers paused as he reached into the satchel, pulling out the documents one by one. He flipped through them quickly, his brow furrowing as he read the first page, and the second. Clara watched his face closely, waiting for his reaction. His eyes widened in disbelief as he read the notarized confession from Edward Whitlow. "Where did you get these?" the lawyer asked, his voice low. Clara met his gaze for the first time since entering the room. "They were stolen from me," she whispered. "My father's land, my family's name, taken when I was too young to fight. I've lived as a maid in my own house for 35 years, but I won't stay silent anymore." The lawyer nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't need to ask any more questions. He knew what he had to do. He looked at Clara with a new sense of respect. "You have a case, a strong case, and I'll represent you, pro bono." Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of her father's legacy was enough. She had finally found someone who would help her, someone who would fight for her. And now, the Harringtons would know what it felt like to lose everything. The day the case was filed, the city seemed to hold its breath. The headline screamed, "Johnson versus Harrington. The maid sues the billionaire?" News outlets couldn't get enough of the scandal. Reporters gathered in throngs, eager for the drama, for the underdog to finally stand up to the elite. Clara had waited for this moment for 35 years, but when the reality set in, she found herself struggling to keep her resolve intact. She had spent so long in silence, in the shadows, that now, standing in the spotlight, the weight of her mission felt almost unbearable. But there was no turning back now. The courtroom was a sight to behold. It was as if the world had turned out to witness the clash of titans, the powerful Harringtons versus the former Maid. It was supposed to be an easy win for the Harringtons. After all, they were rich, influential, and used to getting what they wanted. But Clara wasn't just any maid. She was the rightful heir to the Johnson estate, and the truth was on her side. The Harringtons sat in their usual positions. Richard, the smirking billionaire, with his mother Beatrice sitting beside him, her eyes narrowed in disdain. The lawyer they had hired, Douglas Hale, was already arranging his files, his demeanor oozing confidence. He didn't even look at Clara as she entered the room. To him, she was just a nuisance, a woman who had been out of place for too long.
Clara stood by her lawyer, Michael Turner, a young man with fire in his eyes. He was different from the others who had dismissed her. He believed in her, in the truth she carried. As Clara settled into her seat, she couldn't help but glance around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the people who had gathered. Some looked at her with pity, others with disbelief. But there was one thing Clara knew for sure. Today, the world would hear her story. They would hear the truth. Michael stood up and began his opening statement. His voice was firm, unwavering, and filled with the weight of all the years Clara had spent in silence. He spoke about fraud, about theft, and about the Johnson estate that had been stolen from Clara when she was too young to understand what was happening. He spoke of the documents she had gathered, the confession from Edward Whitlow, and how all of it pointed to one truth. The Harringtons had stolen everything from Clara. As Michael spoke, Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the Harringtons. Richard's face had turned pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by a flicker of unease. Beatrice, however, remained calm, her lips tight, her eyes glinting with cold resolve. They hadn't expected this. They had thought Clara was a mere ghost of the past, a woman they could dismiss. But she wasn't. She was their reckoning. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the first witness was called. Richard's former associates, wealthy businessmen in sharp suits, took the stand, each one testifying with rehearsed ease. They all echoed the same sentiment. Clara Johnson was nothing more than a servant, a woman with no standing, no claim to the estate. To them, she was just another poor black maid trying to ruin the lives of the rich and powerful. But as each of them spoke, Clara remained still, her silence louder than their words. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth would speak for her. When Michael cross-examined the first witness, cracks began to appear. He pressed them on dates, on documents, and on the payments they had received from the Harringtons. The men began to falter, their rehearsed answers unraveling. Clara could see it, their confidence slipping, their facade cracking. The truth was slipping through their fingers, and they didn't even know it yet.
The tension in the room continued to build. Richard Harrington sat back in his chair,
arms crossed, his jaw clenched tight. Beatrice's eyes darted nervously between the defense and the prosecution. They had no idea what was coming, but Clara did. She had been waiting for this moment for so long that it felt like a lifetime. She had the evidence, she had the truth, and she wasn't going to let it slip away now. Finally, Michael stood. The room fell silent as he placed a sealed folder on the table in front of the judge. He spoke slowly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Your Honor," he began, "the time has come to present critical evidence." The gallery shifted in their seats, whispers spreading like wildfire. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Michael open the folder. The first piece of evidence he presented was a copy of the original deed to the Johnson estate, signed by her father, Samuel Johnson. The crowd gasped as they saw the signature, the seal of the Johnson family, undeniable proof of Clara's inheritance. One by one, Michael presented the rest of the documents. Bank transfers showing how Clara's inheritance had been siphoned into the Harrington accounts, and finally, Edward Whitlow's notarized confession. As Michael placed each document on the judge's bench, Clara felt the weight of decades of pain and injustice lift from her shoulders. She had waited for this moment. Now it was here. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. The Harringtons' faces went ashen as they realized what was happening. Richard's confident smirk had disappeared, replaced by a look of pure rage. Beatrice's eyes filled with panic as she tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear their empire was crumbling. And then Clara stood. Her frail form trembled slightly, but her finger was unwavering as she pointed directly at Richard Harrington. Her voice rang out, clear and steady, though every word was filled with years of repressed pain. "For 35 years, I scrubbed your floors, cooked your meals, and raised your children," she began. "But I am Clara Johnson, the rightful heir to the Johnson estate that you stole. You have lived your life of luxury on land that was never yours, and now I will make sure you pay for it." The courtroom went deathly silent. For the first time, Clara's voice had filled the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Richard Harrington, standing tall moments ago, now looked like a man who had been caught in a storm. His arrogance was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous: fear. Beatrice's face had drained of color, her usual composure shattered, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if to steady herself. Clara's finger remained pointed at Richard, unwavering. "You have lived a life of lies," she continued, her voice now strong, commanding. "Every stone in that mansion, every penny in your bank account was bought with the blood, sweat, and tears of my family. You stole my father's legacy. You made me a ghost in my own home. But not anymore. I'm here to reclaim what is mine." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The weight of Clara's words echoed against the walls. Some gasped in disbelief. Others were filled with awe. But there was no mistaking the power of her words. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. Richard took a step forward, but the anger that once fueled him was now replaced by desperation. "This is absurd," he spat, his voice cracking. "You're nothing but a liar." But Clara didn't flinch. The truth is written in black and white, and it's time for the world to see it. Outside the courthouse, the sun blazed overhead, but for Clara, it felt like the first real light she had seen in 35 years. For the first time in decades, she felt free. The gallery erupted. Some gasped in disbelief. Others shouted accusations, shaking their heads in anger. Beatrice's face blanched, her pearls rattling as her chest heaved with panic. Richard Harrington surged to his feet, his arrogance completely shattered, replaced by a searing rage. "Lies!" he bellowed, his voice breaking with fury. "She's just an old woman, a delusional fool." But Michael Turner stood firm, calmly placing the confession from Edward Whitlow on the judge's bench. "Not lies," he said, his voice carrying weight. "Sworn testimony, and it names both Beatrice and Richard Harrington as the beneficiaries of the fraud that destroyed Clara Johnson's family." The judge, his hands trembling, read the documents. His brow furrowed deeper with every line, and his expression darkened. "This is damning," he muttered, unable to hide his shock. Beatrice stood up, her hands clutching the rail in front of her. "No, no," she stammered. "This isn't true. This can't be." But the weight of Clara's finger, her unwavering gaze, and the murmurs from the jury only grew louder. The flashes from the cameras intensified, capturing every moment of her defiance. The once imposing Harrington matriarch was crumbling, and she knew it. Richard slammed his hand down on the table, his composure shattered. "Silence!" he roared, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. But no one listened. The courtroom buzzed like a hive, the whispers growing louder and louder until they became a chorus. "She's the rightful heir," a voice from the gallery said. Another joined in. "The maid is the true owner. The Harringtons are thieves." Richard's face twisted in rage, his eyes burning with hatred. But it was fear that lurked behind the fury. He could no longer hide from the truth. Beatrice, her grip on the rail weakening, staggered as if the very foundation beneath her was giving way. "This is slander! Do you hear me?" she cried, her voice breaking. But her body betrayed her. Her face drained of color, and the pearls she had worn for decades snapped, scattering across the polished wood with a sharp crack. And then, in a devastating moment, Beatrice collapsed. Gasps ripped through the room as the Harrington matriarch fell to the floor, her body convulsing once before going still. A cry rang out, "Call 911!" Another rushed to the door. Richard, his voice no longer filled with arrogance, dropped to his knees beside her. "Mother, mother, stay with me," he shouted, his once dominant presence now filled with desperation. His tears were real now, but they weren't for the truth. They were for himself, for the empire he knew was crumbling before his eyes. The paramedics rushed in moments later, their sirens cutting through the air. They lifted Beatrice onto a stretcher, her face pale, her body limp. The cameras flashed furiously as they wheeled her past the stunned jury, and the gallery erupted into a frenzy of whispers, some in shock, others in awe. Clara didn't move. She stood tall, her finger still pointed at Richard Harrington, her hand trembling slightly under the weight of it all. For 35 years, she had been silent, invisible. Today, she had spoken. Today, the world had heard her. The judge's gavel slammed down with a resounding crack. "Order! Order in the court!" he called, but even he knew that order had already been lost. Richard stood, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and fear. His eyes locked onto Clara's, and beneath the fury, there was something new, something raw and vulnerable. The Harrington Empire had been built on lies and deceit, but in a single day, in a single woman's trembling voice, it had started to collapse. The courthouse doors swung open, and Clara Johnson stepped into the blinding afternoon sun. The reporters were already there, their cameras aimed at her, their microphones thrust forward. For a moment, Clara paused at the top of the steps. Her frail figure stood tall against the flash of cameras and the roar of voices. The whispers from the crowd filled the air. "That's her," someone said. "She's the maid who pointed at him." She didn't bow her head. Not anymore. For decades, Clara had carried the weight of poverty, the sting of mockery, and the silence of invisibility. But now her name, Johnson, rang across the city, no longer as a servant, but as the rightful heir. She had dared to stand against the Harrington Empire, and in doing so, she had reclaimed everything they had stolen from her. Richard lingered inside, his face pale with humiliation. The whispers that had once turned to scorn now turned to headlines. Maid exposes billionaire, Johnson heir revealed. The power that had once seemed untouchable was crumbling. The world now knew the truth. Clara descended the steps slowly, each footfall a victory. The weight of 35 years seemed to lift from her shoulders with every step. She could hear the murmurs in the crowd. "She's the true heir," someone said. "She's the rightful owner of the estate." At the bottom of the stairs, Michael Turner joined her, his smile one of quiet pride. "Mrs. Johnson, you did it," he said softly. "The world knows the truth now." Clara turned her face toward the sun, her lined features calm, her eyes steady. "No," she replied, her voice gentle. "The truth did it. I just lived long enough to see it rise." For the first time in decades, Clara allowed herself a smile. It wasn't the end of her journey. The courts would decide the rest. But for Clara, her silence was over. The world had finally heard her voice, and nothing could take that away. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that truth always rises.